Once upon a time, elsewhere, in another time, who knows where or when, there was a knight, a noble fighting man of power and wealth, with the favor of a king, who had been granted land and a title. Who he was and where he came from are of little import. Perhaps he had been a peasant, who by happy chance was rocketed up through the layers of his fiefdom, or perhaps he had been born into his office. All that mattered were his hungers for glory and riches, fame and fortune. His people hailed him as a hero for having fought in many a crusade, and he had the good fortune to split the spoils most profitably with his comrades. Yet still our knight hungered for more, and sitting alone on his throne, watching lesser nobles celebrate, he silently lusted for greater riches still. The knight had never taken a wife, nor had he any heirs to carry on his name. Such matters were for one destined to die and be forgotten. This knight, however, desired immortality, to live on in people's memories long after his death. Thus, when word reached his ear of dragon fire sighted in the skies to the south of his realm, the knight eagerly leapt at the challenge. He called for a squad of horses, supplied with provisions enough for 2 weeks' journey, and the finest fighters in the realm to join him on this glorious quest. Nobody answered the call, needless to say, for the finest fighters in the realm had become the finest fighters in the realm by staying alive long enough to become the finest fighters in the realm. So instead of numbers, he pursued an alternate scheme. The knight sought out an ancient wizard in the deep forests to the east of his lands. The knight nearly kicked down the wizard's door upon his arrival, bellowing, "Old man, I come seeking magic arms and armor, that I might do battle with the dragon to the south." Little did our knight realize that, long ago when he was still young, the wizard had made a deal with that same dragon to add dazzling magic treasures to its hoard, in return for magical knowledge, and the continuing exchanges were still going. The wizard nodded, flashing a grimy grin. "Indeed, Sir Knight, it would be my great honor to enchant your lovely sword." He waved his hand and uttered a few arcane phrases. "Kutiki-kutiki-koo, your sword shall always avail you. Neither man nor beast, nor the mountains east, shall be standing when mighty steel flashes before thee. Scissors slice rock, even steel armor. When your sword comes forth, it'll cut through anything. Bang!" The knight paused. "My sword doesn't feel any different. Are you sure that was a spell?" The wizard cackled. "May dragonfire singe my beard if it was not!" Placing his hands upon the knight's shield, the wizard uttered another incantation. "Tippecanoe and Tyler too, no magic shall bring harm to you. Against dragon's glare, even fire don't care. Raise your shield and it shall protect you." This time the knight felt something. He felt taller, and the wizard seemed no more than a shriveled old man. "My thanks, conjurer. I shall see that you are richly rewarded for this." Before he could turn to leave, however, the wizard caught hold of the knight's arm, holding him back. "Wait, Sir Knight," the wizard added with a sly grin. "Against the dragon's enchantment and fire you are protected, it is true, and your sword shall slice through its hide like butter. But what, I ask, of the dragon's talons? I can cast a spell to make your armor impenetrable." The knight liked the idea, but something felt off about the suggestion. "I thought you said my shield made me immune to magic. Doesn't that mean you can't enchant my armor?" Again the wizard cackled, dancing about his filthy little shack, waving his hands in the air as he chanted, "Against those who bring harm you're protected, it's true, but my magic seeks only to help you. Woo-hoo! With the charm that seeks to harden your arm, there is nothing on earth to conceal you. I give you protection like dragon's hide. Neither spear nor talon shall pierce your side. Not teeth, not sword, nor a 2x4 shall ever draw fear from your quivering eye." Though the knight appreciated the enchantment, something didn't make sense. "Even without your magic, why would I ever fear a 2x4? The wizard shrugged. Look, buddy, if you can make a better rhyme, you're welcome to try. And so, somewhat befuddled, the knight set out for the lands south, to confront the mighty dragon and claim its hoard for himself. Through village after village he passed, questioning locals, and time after time he was pointed onward to the next village. "I think they saw it down there," was the general answer. Nearly a week later, he finally heard the answer he was looking for. The dragon's mountain loomed ahead as the knight trudged up a twisting path far too treacherous for his horse. Despite the cool autumn weather at the mountain's foot, the knight found the air growing hotter as he climbed. Smoke billowed from the mountainside, filling the air with a foul, sulfuric stench. Rock slides triggered on all sides, miraculously missing the knight's narrow passage, triggered by the earth-shaking sounds of snoring within the mountain. By the time the knight reached the mountain's summit, the padding beneath his mail was soaked, itching with both the heavy wool itself and the swarm of flies attracted by the stench of sweat mixed with said wool. Such a rancid aroma issued from the weary knight that a handful of vultures had gathered overhead, convinced that something had died, and were even then zeroing in on the supposed carrion. Bolstered by the treacherous wizard's promises of magic protection, the knight's heart beat fast and quick. Leaning against a large boulder, the knight took hold of his canteen for a refreshing lick of water. Due to the heat, he had long ago drunk the last drop, but there was still some moisture inside if he probed a bit with his tongue. After a sorely unsatisfying rest, the knight set off into the gaping mouth of the dragon's lair. The opening was immense, easily large enough for 50 men to walk side by side, and it was high enough to swallow a castle. Naturally, it would have been a tight squeeze for the dragon. The knight laughed aloud at the thought, albeit somewhat wearily. Inside, he found cavern upon cavern piled high with gold. Gold coins, statues, wondrous jewels, and silver. A giant tablet engraved with runes and molded from pure gold. It was all wealth beyond the knight's wildest dreams. What he could not find, however, was the alleged dragon, nor could he find any logical source of the thick smoke. Several hours passed as the knight ran throughout the many chambers, searching in a mad, mindless frenzy for the blasted beast. Throughout the evening and the night he searched, occasionally peeking under rocks on the off chance that this was an especially tiny dragon to have eluded him for so long. As the sun rose the second day and the sounds of roosters crowing echoed into the deeps, the knight sat back against a statue, shaking his head, convinced that there was, in fact, no dragon after all. There were riches beyond his wildest dreams, enough to satisfy his every rational desire, and yet the knight found himself disappointed with such winnings. He had expected the treasure to be a reward for a glorious struggle. Hands on hips, eyes rolling at the ceiling, the knight heaved a sigh, fully intending to organize an expedition to retrieve all this wealth upon his return, when the rumbling began. At first the knight didn't notice. When the ground lurched to one side, he dismissed it as exhaustion. But when stalactites plunged from the ceiling, nearly impaling him as they landed, the knight knew this was not the case. A roar from the cave's entrance confirmed beyond any doubt that there was indeed a dragon. The knight drew his sword, in spite of the fact that he was so weary he could barely hold it up. What a fine tale that would make, returning home and telling people of how he'd slain a dragon while half asleep. Alas, it was not to happen. As the immense reptilian form lurched around a corner, the knight's legs failed him, and he stumbled to his knees. It was far larger than he had ever imagined, its wings spreading wide enough to cut a cavern clean in half, and its mighty back rising clear to the ceiling. Flames gushed from its jaws with each breath, and its eyes shone with power, flashing as they flicked from one side to the other. Remembering the wizard's spells, the knight raised his shield. As had happened with the wizard, the knight felt calm, as the shield dispelled the dragon's enchantment of despair and indecision, and summoned a cool breeze to blow away the oppressive heat. With a mad shout, The knight rushed onward, sword held over his head in what he would later regard as the worst form of his career, and swung it forward, hacking deep into the armor of the dragon's belly. And there the sword stayed, embedded as it was in the scaly armor, and tug as he might, the knight simply could not wrench it free. The dragon laughed in the face of the knight's puny efforts. "A magic sword? How unoriginal!" With a great clawed hand, the dragon plucked the sword free and flung it aside. The sword, true to its enchantment, cut through the hoard of gold where it landed, plunging into the glittering depths where it was forever lost. The knight staggered back in shock, his only thought being to protect himself. He raised the shield, anticipating an imminent rush of flame, which never came. The same hand that had claimed the sword took away the knight's shield, nearly wrenching the knight's arm from his shoulder as it yanked the shield away. "And a magic shield," the dragon yawned. "You've pulled out all the stops, haven't you? I assume your armor is also magic." The knight took a deep breath, holding his voice as firm as he could as he answered. "It is indeed. There is no weapon that can pierce it. You cannot harm me, dragon. Therefore I suggest we call this a draw, and part ways." "Oh, I suggest we don't," the dragon answered without missing a beat. Its tail flashed about, swatting the knight aside and sending him flying against a wall with a resounding clatter. The dragon approached the fallen knight, leering down at him with grim satisfaction. "Now, this is usually the part where I devour you." The dragon shook its sides, rattling with the sounds of thousands of suits of armor within. "But then, how many brave knights can a dragon devour before it all gets boring, 100, the knight guessed in his daze. "1, the dragon bellowed. "The first taste of noblemen is glorious!" At this the dragon shrugged. "After that, it's all downhill." Shaking its great head, the dragon concluded, "Now, let's do something a bit different this time." The knight found himself nodding emphatically. "I offer you my hoard for a year to do with as you please," the dragon began. "Invest it, make a profit as you can. How you do it is entirely up to you. If you do make a profit, you may keep that for yourself as a reward alongside your life." Then the dragon flashed a grin as the second shoe dropped. "If, however, you lose a single coin, I shall devour you, and you will be remembered as nothing more than a number, a statistic, one victim of many." The knight stifled a squeal of terror. "Unless," the dragon finished, "unless you can answer a riddle. I shall ask it now so that you have a full year to ponder it. I think that's quite generous, don't you?" "Very generous indeed," the knight answered, his head spinning with terror. The dragon gestured to the cavern around them. "Out of all my hoard, I possess 3 treasures I prize above all others. Gold is dull and dark beside them. Silver appears tarnished in their presence. While all other treasures will be lost in time, my 3 special treasures are eternal. Should you fail your little test, but discover what these 3 special treasures are, I will give them to you, without reserve or hesitation, and never again will I trouble these lands." The dragon took a step forward, leaning in closer to the knight. "That said, do we have a deal?" The knight tried to shake the sleep from his head, giving the dragon's so-called riddle a long, hard thought. What could possibly be so valuable as to shame the rest of this glorious hoard? At long last, despite the daunting task before him, the knight nodded. The dragon flashed a malicious grin. "Then let the games begin!" All at once there was a flash of light, and the knight found himself staring down at a little man in armor. The man on the floor was the knight, he realized. But how could this be? "Oh, one final condition," the man on the floor spoke up, his tone identical to that of the dragon. "For the next year, you must operate as a dragon, living by the same code as I. Don't worry, it's all recorded in plain sight. I believe you passed a golden tablet. It is a record of my people's law. With my eyes, you should be able to read it now." With a grin, the dragon man waved an admonishing finger towards the night dragon. "But don't get any ideas about killing me in this form. Should your body die, I will return to mine, and you, well, you'll be returned to a corpse." Scooping up a bag of gold and jewels, the dragon man set off for the lair's exit. "Enjoy your spoils, while you can." Then he was gone, leaving the knight alone, trapped in his monstrous new form, to grapple with the question, how was he supposed to do business as a dragon? People would attack him on sight. For a long time the knight sat in silence, mystified at his transformation. The wings sprouting from his scaly shoulders felt odd, limbs present where there had always been nothing. He found himself awkwardly struggling to manipulate them, if only to hold them steady at his sides, where they would not be wrenched off with his every motion. His tail, likewise, felt strange, digging between his feet as he turned about, but so long that he had to turn back in order to sweep it aside. He shambled about with a waddling gait, struggling to regain his mobility. The mountainside shook often as the knight staggered against walls and rammed his back against the cavern's ceilings. Some hours later he found his way back to the golden tablet. After all, if he were to live as a dragon and abide by their laws, he needed to know what those laws were. Initially, the curious writings left his head spinning. It was less like reading a manuscript and more like navigating a maze. Curious, magic phrases spun and bent, swirling about and meeting up with others. One thing collided with another, combining into a new image altogether. Truly, only a mind as sharp as a dragon's could have comprehended even a portion of the mad jumble. For hours the knight sat on his haunches, reptilian chin cupped in his great clawed hands, scanning the tablet for some fragment of meaning. It happened slowly, as his mind grew accustomed to the sensations and instincts of his new body. A pattern here, a reflection there. Little by little he came to recognize a single thread, running down the middle of it all, into which all other threads were woven. His mind began to process the curious letters of the dragon's written language, and he spotted repeated references to a summit, in the sense of a negotiation of sorts. Phrases unraveled before his eyes, becoming fragments of longer thoughts, intersecting and winding together. Laws and regulations related to one another. Shaking his head, the knight realized that standing there before him was a lawyer's nightmare. Yet the summit remained, a meeting of all the dragons in the land. How many, the knight couldn't be sure, to be held at the changing of the seasons. It was, as near as the knight could figure, a time to trade, to buy and sell treasures, an opportunity to give younger dragons a chance to build their own hoards. In a rush, the knight realized that August was nearing its end at that moment. The summit would be held any day now. Yet the knight could not spring into action due to the sheer bulk of his form. The best he could manage was to lurch into inaction, twisting his great head about to examine what riches lay on the ground about him. He needed only split-second glances at a time to tell him what was there, for it is said that all dragons are aware of the contents of their hoards, down to the last coin, and they are keenly aware of the value of each item. The same enchantment that grants this insight has been known to drive lesser creatures mad with greed. Through cavern after cavern the knight slunk, crawling on his stomach to avoid scraping his wings off against the ceilings. Quick scans of each chamber filled his mind with a jumble of values in multiple currencies. Exchange rates, inflation, deflation, appreciation, depreciation, as the knight slowly began to feel at home in his new surroundings. He grew more relaxed, and, as he turned a final corner, he fell asleep. Let's face it, he was tired. His mind was spinning after staring at the tablet for hours, and all this information would have overwhelmed any human mind, with or without the benefit of dragon magic. Yet upon waking, he immediately flew into a panic. He could feel that something was wrong, and after a quick patrol of his caverns, the knight knew what it was. While he slept, someone had crept into his lair, possibly at the dragon's urging, and stolen a silver cup. It wasn't magical, and its value was only moderate, but the dragon's warning still echoed in the knight's ears. "If you lose even a single coin, I will devour you." Like any dragon that had just been robbed, the knight erupted from the side of the mountain, howling with a mixture of rage and terror, and belching forth clouds of smoke and flame that blocked out the sun and withered nearby trees. Had he been set up for failure, the knight wondered? It had only been his first day in charge of the horde, and already something had gone wrong. He gazed out over the countryside, eyes zeroing in like a hawk on a glint of metal. The night dragon thundered down the mountainside, his every step shaking the ground beneath him, in hot pursuit of the tiny figure scurrying before him like a mouse. A lash of the knight's tail whipped the thief's feet out from under him, sending him tumbling down a nearby gully in the mountainside, the knight's claws closing around the silver cup before it vanished from sight. His head swung low, a murderous fire in his eyes and mouth as he scanned for the little man that nearly cost him his life. Yet what he found stopped him cold. A mere boy of 15, dressed in rags, famished and malnourished. The boy held forth a dagger, clearly ready to defend himself, but his shaking arm betrayed the futility of his silent threat. The knight saw terror in the boy's eyes, but more importantly, he saw what might well have been himself, just a few hours earlier. The night dragon roared in warning, blasting a gust of smoke down the gully, and then took to the air, wings driving forth mighty gales that uprooted trees and tossed them about. He circled the mountainside several times, blasting his flame into the sky and warning against any others who might choose to invade his lair. Alas, his tactic backfired. Far to the east he heard another roar in answer, thunderous in volume, accompanied by a series of bursts of flame that lit up the clouds with a blood-red glow. To the north there came a second answer, then a third from the south. The knight's stomach turned into knots as he guessed the significance, and he rushed back into his lair to confirm his suspicions. Once more he looked upon the great tablet, his eyes slowly adjusting to the whirl of phrases and images. Yes, there was a summit to be held, in which dragons sought to increase their hordes by bartering with one another. The signal for it to begin was for what the tablet designated as the Great One, to shoot a blast of flame into the sky above the chosen site. Other dragons would then answer in kind to signal their affirmation. Color drained from the night dragon's face as it dawned on him. Every dragon in the land would be converging on one spot. His mountain, his realm, his home. And no doubt they would all be after his horde. The first to arrive was an immensely fat, dark blue dragon. He slunk quietly up the side of the mountain, a bit slow as he struggled to negotiate his considerable weight among the many crags and ridges of the mountainside, but he never wavered and never halted his climb. The night dragon was waiting at the entrance of his lair as his first guest reached the peak, having already been shaken considerably by the initial theft of the silver cup, and even further perturbed upon realizing he had unknowingly started the summit he had been so unprepared for. The night dragon was paranoid, to say the least. The fat dragon, however, did not appear to share his sentiments. "Ah, Great One," the fat dragon greeted with a bow of his immense neck. His voice had a light, mellow tone, quite unlike what the knight would have expected from a dragon. There was a faintly hypnotic quality about it, which made the knight shake his head in an effort to clear the growing haze from his mind. The fat dragon went on. "It is an honor to be invited to your humble abode. Never before have you elected to hold the summit here at your place of residence." The knight, however, was busy glancing this way and that, as dragon after dragon of every shape and size landed all about the mountain, each one laden with sacks of golden gems slung across their shoulders like a horse's saddlebags. "It was a bit of a surprise for me as well," the knight replied after a short hesitation. The fat dragon's mouth curled into a lazy smile.
"Would you be so good as to direct me to my chambers? I wish to rest after my long journey."
"Chambers?"
"Of course," the fat dragon went on. "Do you not remember? It is customary for the Great One to make arrangements for us at the summit. I'm afraid such is the price of choosing the time and place of our meeting."
"Right," the knight muttered. "Of course. Follow me." He led the fat dragon into his cave, and after crawling about for a time, found a cavern that appeared to satisfy his unwanted guest. Returning once more to the entrance, he found several more dragons waiting for him. There was a small one, about the size of a sparrow, perched on the tip of a much larger dragon's snout, both of whom desired to share a chamber with the other. A serpentine, bearded dragon, who smelled strongly of river scum, bowed low, offering tribute of 2 great sacks of pearls in return for accommodations. Now, the night dragon's lair was extensive, and he was able to find space for a good many of the dragons, but the last one, a fairly young dragon, it should be noted, left the knight especially shaken when she asked, "Why are you housing all of us in your cave? Are you not worried we might steal your treasures?" "Of course not," the knight lied. "If it is customary that I do so, then I would assume the others would be honorable." The young dragon smirked, a faint light of recognition flickering in her eyes. She restrained a grin and entered the knight's lair without further question. It was then that the knight realized he had just been deceived. As he entered his cave, and the sounds of the other dragons carousing and greeting each other fell silent, the knight's suspicions were confirmed. Throughout the following week, the knight kept a close eye on his guests, and managed to catch several hiding a few trinkets here and there in their bags. He also noticed the number of dragons drastically decreasing, while the girth of those remaining appeared to steadily increase. Every so often, one coughed up a flurry of coins. Offers were made, answered with counter-offers. The dragons haggled ceaselessly. By the end of the first day, only one object had changed hands, and neither buyer nor seller was satisfied with the arrangement. The night dragon made a number of attempts to protect his hoard by joining in the buying and selling, yet he was inevitably faced with the question, "Where do I put my profits? The fact is, with all these competing dragons living amidst my hoard, not one coin is safe." Those of the dragons that remained finally departed at sundown of the 7th day. The knight stared in shock as the steady procession emerged from his caves and took to the air once more. It was as if they had each nearly doubled in size. The serpentine dragon, most shocking of all, resembled an enormous sphere as he lifted off and sailed over the horizon. Where the dragons had once carried only 1 bag of gold, each now carried as many as 8, most of which, the knight guessed, had belonged to those unfortunate dragons that mysteriously vanished. The last dragon to leave, and the only one that appeared unchanged, was the fat dragon, the first one to arrive 1 week ago.
"Ah, a fine summit that was,"
he sighed as he eased out the mouth of the cave.
"Most profitable, too."
He carried 10 sacks of gold, so much that, in addition to his own weight, it was remarkable he could move at all. "Yes," the night dragon observed, "it would be when the lot of you lie and cheat your way into my cave." The fat one shrugged.
"Alas, lying and cheating are the oldest customs of all."
"Older than the Great One providing caverns for you?" The fat dragon grinned, a sly twinkle in his eye.
"Much older indeed. Farewell."
With that, he slunk out of sight, vanishing over a nearby ledge. As the knight returned to his caves, he could feel the difference in the air. The walls and floor still sparkled with fabulous wealth. There was no doubt the hoard was still worth a fortune, and yet the knight could sense that it had been greatly diminished. He had been fleeced for nearly all he was worth. He collapsed upon a pile of gold, rolling his eyes at the ceiling, and his soul shivered with dread at the day, less than a year from now, that the true dragon would return. The knight had failed the dragon's first test. His only chance now, he knew, was to unravel its riddle and discover the dragon's 3 greatest treasures. With those heavy thoughts on his mind, the knight fell into a deep sleep. He no longer worried over thieves creeping into his lair, for he had unknowingly admitted a great many just a few days ago. With that off his chest, he no longer concerned himself with doing business or guarding his hoard. Yet one thing still haunted his deepest fears. What if the 3 great treasures had been among those already stolen? What hope, then, might the knight have of learning what they were, and how might the dragon react upon learning they had been lost? Hope fled the knight's soul as he plunged into dark, foreboding dreams of what appeared to be looming just over the horizon. Upon waking the following morning, the knight fell about the dismal task of taking inventory. Perhaps he might unearth a few obscure gems, literal and figurative, along the way. Material for both the riddle and the next summit 3 months hence. Yet the caverns were extensive, and by the day's end he had only made it through a few caves. Weeks of tedium passed, while outside September gave way to October. Occasionally the knight emerged from his caves and looked out on the changing colors of the leaves. As All Hallows' Eve approached and passed, he spotted the signs of the season. People arrayed holy symbols to ward off malicious spirits about their homes, while children ran wild in the streets, dressed as witches, ghosts, goblins, and the like. The knight occasionally wondered how the dragon was managing his affairs. Hopefully better than he had managed the dragons at the summit. He pictured all the disasters that might occur as a dragon took on a knight's responsibilities. Loss of land, frivolously spent funds, peasants dancing in the streets as the treasury steadily dwindled. The knight chuckled, and then considered the alternative. Dragons were known for a love of treasure. He could picture this one taxing his subjects out of house and home. One day in mid-November, the knight finally had enough speculation and decided to leave the task of evaluating his hoard for another day. He emerged from his lair, spread his wings, and set off in flight. Perhaps a view from the air might be enough to reassure him. Almost immediately as he sailed over his lands, a great cry went up, accompanied by calls for the dragon slayer. The knight settled on a high, grassy hill, folding his wings as he watched for the promised hero. To his knowledge, he had been the only man in recent memory to confront a dragon, and that dragon was very much alive. Much to his surprise, the knight saw an unarmored figure riding out of what had once been the knight's very castle, directly for the hill he perched upon. As the figure approached, the knight recognized its face from the many mirrors he had passed in his life. Of all people, this dragon slayer was him. At the very least, it was the dragon that wore his body. At first the night dragon was offended, as the dragon knight below dismounted and fearlessly approached him unarmed. Yet he recalled the dragon's warning, that should either of their bodies die, the spell would be broken, and the two would be returned to their proper forms. It was only natural the dragon knight would be unarmed. "Greetings, my friend," the dragon knight announced as he climbed the hill. "Forgive me for saying so, but you do have another 9 months before we switch back to our proper places." "I wanted to see my realms," the night dragon answered. "I wanted to know how they fared in my absence." "They fare quite well," the dragon knight answered. "Perhaps better than when it was you who ruled, and not a reptilian impostor. Would you care to take a look?" The night dragon was aghast. "How would I do that without causing a panic?" "You are a dragon," the dragon knight answered, as though that would explain everything. "The magic is inherent within you. Feel it! Reach deep inside! Will yourself to become human!" The night dragon did as he was told, and lo and behold, it happened. He felt himself shrinking, growing smaller and smaller, until he was looking up into the dragon knight's face. He stumbled, not only unused to being human once more, but also the awkward distribution of his new body's weight. Looking down at himself in shock, he exclaimed, "I'm a woman!" The dragon knight nodded. "Indeed you are, and if you'll pardon me saying so, you wear the form marvelously." Bowing in mock politeness, he added, "If you'll come with me, milady, I'll take you for a ride through our realm." The night dragon didn't dare strike his host, for fear of permanently damaging himself. Such a misfortune would haunt him till the end of his days, assuming they lasted more than a few minutes. The dragon knight, in a remarkable display of courtesy, guided his guest's awkward steps down the hill to where his horse awaited. Minutes later, the two were on their way, trotting briskly through the heart of the city below. Peasants waved to the dragon knight as he passed, and with a sparkling grin, he returned the gesture. "They never used to wave to me," the night dragon muttered. The dragon knight laughed. "Well, I'm a lot nicer than you were." The night dragon was amazed at the changes he saw in his lands. People seemed better fed, happier, healthier, and in an all-around improved state of being. He wondered for a moment if it weren't all some illusion concocted by the dragon, only to remember that he was, in fact, the only dragon present. Back in the knight's castle, he and his host shared a meal. It took some time for the night dragon to grow accustomed to the admiring stares of other men as he passed, but his host took it in stride. In private, the two dined together. The night dragon's worst fears had been laid to rest. This dragon that ruled in his place was not the tyrant he had feared. "But what of the treasury?" the night dragon asked. "Richer than ever," the dragon knight assured him. "I am something of a wizard with business, you'll no doubt guess." The night dragon nodded silently. "And what of my hoard?" the dragon knight asked abruptly. By the look on his face, it was clear he already knew the answer, and that answer appeared to amuse him. The night dragon coughed, choking down his mouthful at the unexpected question. "Well, as you might guess, the summit has been held this season." "Any trouble calling it?" The night dragon shook his head. "A little bit too easy, actually." "It started without your knowing!" A broad grin spread over the dragon knight's face. The night dragon nodded. "They called me Great One. They said it was the Great One's responsibility to summon the others." "Indeed it is." "So why am I the Great One?" "It's quite simple, really," the dragon knight explained. "You, or technically it would be I, are the first dragon, born before all others. I am the lawgiver, the one who first wrote down our code and brought order to our kind. All others are our offspring." The night dragon sat back in a daze. "And I challenged you to a fight?" "Surely you noticed you were the largest dragon at the summit." The night dragon's appetite was gone with this revelation. He sat back and pushed his plate away. "And I'm supposed to unravel your riddle?" "A riddle asked with the wisdom of ages?" The dragon knight paused and nodded. "Yes, you are." He paused, taking in the night dragon's reaction, his uncharacteristically female face having gone totally pale. "Believe it or not, I want you to succeed." "You what?" The dragon knight nodded. "I do. You see, even after the first 10 years, even that much gold loses its luster. You begin looking for things of greater value." "And did you find any?" The dragon knight grinned. "If I hadn't, I could hardly give them to you." Glancing out the window, he concluded, "It's getting late. A good time to smuggle you back to our hill, wouldn't you say?" As the knight lay coiled in his lair, his mind brooding over the riddle, he found an endless string of contradictions. He had begun to think that the dragon's mention of seeking things more valuable than gold might allude to some sort of ideal. Yet the claim that these 3 treasures could be given away appeared to contradict that thought. Shaking his head, he turned his thoughts to more immediate concerns. November was nearing its end. Soon it would be time for the winter summit. As the harvest days passed by, and people began digging in and hunkering down for the coming winter, the knight fell to searching his caves for anything he might have missed. Day by day he slunk about the deepest caverns, seeking these 3 greatest treasures, and hoping against hope they weren't among what the other dragons had stolen. One night, as the first snow drifted down from the sky, the knight, snug and warm in the deepest chambers, stumbled upon a breakthrough. His eyes, growing accustomed to a dragon's sight, spotted a faint outline in a cavern wall. As he drew close, the wall fell away in response to his proximity. Within, he discovered a hidden chamber. In stark contrast to the other caverns, there was no gold scattered in there, just a stone pedestal atop which sat a large crystal orb, which looked as though it had been carved from diamond. This, of course, should have been impossible, but yet there it was before the knight's very eyes. Due to its hidden location and prominence within the chamber, the knight was convinced that it must have been one of the 3 greatest treasures, yet it was still only a gem, and like the dragon had said, "There comes a time that all gold loses its luster." So despite its size and beauty, the knight was about to dismiss the orb, when something caught his eye. He slunk deeper in, peering closer. There were scenes playing out within the orb, visions of ordinary people living ordinary lives. A man and his son fishing, an old woman knitting socks, a man parading about in a Santa Claus costume, nuns ministering to the homeless, a woman tucking children into bed, and many more much like the others. There was no obvious value to the orb, no esoteric secrets to be discerned, no warnings of enemies approaching, nothing of any great strategic importance. All in all, it was quite dull. Yet the knight couldn't help but sit transfixed, his soul growing calm and quiet, as he fell asleep in that chamber for the remainder of the night. With the coming of morning, he was surprised to find a great sense of regret welling up inside him as he left the chamber. Outside, he found the world turned white under a blanket of snow. Once more, the seasons had turned. It was time for the next summit. The knight retreated into his lair, picking out a few minor trinkets he wasn't afraid to lose, and armed with the knowledge of what was expected of him, he took off in flight to scout out a new location. He eventually settled on the highest peak of a range of mountains to the north. The land was largely uninhabited, and there were numerous caves and hidey holes in which the dragons could take shelter from the cold. Perching upon the heights, he threw back his head and belched forth a great cloud of fire. Immediately it started raining. Let's face it, heat like that up in those icy clouds. This time the knight knew what to expect, as dragons arrived one by one, staking claims in caves of varying prominence. The largest and strongest claimed the highest and most prominent caves, while the weaker and more cunning claimed lower ones. Most of the dragons met atop a broad plateau, which served as a sort of marketplace to display their wares. As the knight walked among his fellow dragons, he spotted many works of gold and silver and jewels, far more spectacular than what he'd brought. He even recognized a few stolen items from his own hoard, although he didn't recognize the dragons carrying them. For the first day, the knight observed the process. Dragons traded less valuable items for gold, with which they bartered for items of greater value, which in turn were bought and sold for more gold. Feeling confident, he joined in the second day, hoping to reclaim some of the treasures he'd lost. Alas, the haggling was long and bitter, and he closed out the day without having sold so much as a ring. Despite the smoother beginning, time ran short, and in his desperation, the knight found himself making a number of bad sells and even worse buys. As the dragons departed with the ending of this summit, he realized he still was nowhere near the competence of even the youngest dragons. With even less treasure on hand than he had initially set out with, the knight returned to his lair and settled in for a long, cold winter. In the silence of the lonely, dark days, the winter found himself spending more and more time in that secret chamber, gazing into the orb. He watched young men taking young women for sleigh rides, fathers building fires to keep their families warm, strong young men cutting down trees which were then set up and decorated in town squares. Rich men gave alms to bell-ringing Father Christmases on street corners, while beggars filed into church basements for goodwill dinners. Carolers wandered the streets, unaware of the giant, wistful dragon watching them in his cave. Christmas came and went, and the winter turned long and bitter. No creatures stirred upon the mountain slopes, and in time the knight could no longer bear to remain in the chamber, for dread of the lonely silence that filled his golden halls. It was with great joy that, one morning, he emerged from his cave, and in the distance heard the voices of geese returning from the south. The snow was melting and giving way to spring. Looking out over the lands beneath his lonely mountain, the knight saw people stirring in the streets of the city below. For a long time the knight sat at the mouth of his cave, basking in the presence of new life. With this latest turn of seasons, the time had come again for another summit. Wiser still, the knight set out with another, slightly larger bag of trinkets from his hoard, and scouted a new location. Where it was bears little importance to our story. Suffice to say that this time the knight had grown wise enough to make a slight profit. It was nothing compared to what he'd lost at the first summit, but it filled him with a new confidence that he might yet escape the dragon's deadly riddle. Spring gave way to summer. The knight experimented with haggling at the summer summit, and profited greatly in the process. As the week of the summit wore on, the other dragons grew increasingly desperate to make deals, and the knight preyed upon this eagerness. As he returned with his earnings to his lair, he was confident that with the next summit, the autumn summit, he would more than earn back all that he'd lost. His life would be spared, and he could forget about those 3 silly treasures that had caused him such distress over the past year. Alas, he was not to be let off his hook so easily. It was mid-August when, while assessing further treasures to sell at the next summit in the deepest cavern, the knight abruptly found himself standing back at the mouth of the cave. This time, however, the opening seemed far larger than before. The knight could no longer feel his wings, and his tail had vanished. He was human again, and the ground was shaking. The knight squealed in sheer fright, his first thought being to flee. This is not to say he was a coward, but over the past year he had long since ceased to be a fool. Yet he wasn't fast enough. A great clawed hand descended upon him, flipped him onto his back, and pinned him to the ground. "Time's up, Sir Knight," the dragon hissed, a blast of hot wind gushing from its jaws. "I failed you," the knight squeaked. "The hoard, it's—" "After our last meeting, I'd have thought it was obvious," the dragon interrupted. "I don't care about the hoard. Now answer. What are my 3 greatest treasures? What outlasts all the rest? What never loses its luster?" The knight's mind spun, but quickly settled on a possibility. It was indeed something that could be given, for the dragon had already given it to him, through the lessons of the past year. "Wisdom!" The dragon flashed what appeared to be its equivalent of a grin. "A fool and his money are soon parted, as the saying goes. I have found, however, that the wise man's wealth increases tenfold, and he will want for nothing. Should you survive this, I will lend you my wisdom, the wisdom of ages. I will become human and return with you to your realm, providing what insights and advice I can. until the end of your days." The dragon flashed its fangs in warning. "But first, what is the second?" The knight was hard-pressed as he thought back over the past year. He weighed all that he had seen and done. The other dragons, he noticed, had no honor, no ethics to connect them. All at once he blurted out, "Honor!" The dragon's face turned hard, and it flashed an angry sneer. "Honor is the excuse by which vain men challenge themselves to duels and kill each other. Honor can be tarnished. It has no value." The knight visibly paled. He racked his brain for alternatives, thinking back to his codes of chivalry and the things he had always fought for. Truth? Bah, the dragon spat. "Truth has its place, I suppose. Without it, there would be nothing but emptiness. But there are many who prefer lies and falsehoods over the reality before them. Truth, though necessary, is often inconvenient. I would not call it a treasure so much as a necessity." The knight quivered under the dragon's hold, his heart pounding with terror as he fought to think. "You have lived my life," the dragon urged. "You have felt the silence of winter. You have been cut off from all warmth. There was no one you could trust, no one you could turn to. But I know you found comfort. Try to remember." "The orb?" the knight asked incredulously. "The orb was a thing," the dragon answered. "A means to an end. It was cold, hard, a mere stone, but it showed you something to be prized." "Family," the knight thought out loud. "Charity? Generosity? Love?" The dragon closed its eyes, the corners of its mouth curling upwards. "Yes." Before the knight's eyes, it shrank and changed. "Love." Its body grew sleek and pleasantly curving as it transformed into the same woman the knight had become during the previous autumn. "Though a man possess nothing, if he is loved, he will be rich in spirit." The dragon, having become a woman of immense beauty, cupped the knight's head in her hands. "My love is yours, if not as a bride, then as a friend." She knelt at the knight's side and kissed his forehead. "Now for the third." "The third?" the knight repeated. His mind was blank. He tried to think of the things men craved most. He thought of his servants desiring better for themselves. "Freedom?" The dragon closed her eyes and shook her head. "Alas, I have been free for all my years. Yet this freedom has brought only emptiness and uncertainty. Freedom is greatly overrated." The knight stared up into her eyes. He felt his mind clearing, being pushed along by the dragon's influence. Yet still he couldn't imagine what else there might be. "Please," the dragon begged, tears welling at the corners of her eyes. "I need you to find this one. It is every bit as important as the others. Without it, you're just another fighter." The knight struggled to guess. Honesty?" The dragon's voice shook with her head. "Honesty is important, but untempered, it can be destructive." She stroked the knight's forehead, her tears running free. "Please, think. I know you have this in you. I saw it the first day you became a dragon. And I know it's what you need most from me right now." The knight himself succumbed to tears of his own, of terror, of grief at what was so close, and at the realization at last that he was truly just another victim, another number in a long line of numbers. "Please," he found himself begging. "Have mercy." There was a long silence. The dragon blinked, staring for a moment in disbelief. The knight repeated his plea. "Mercy." The dragon wiped her eyes, her face breaking out into a radiant smile. "By mercy, Wars have been ended, lives spared, and the very souls of mankind rescued from the fires of hell. And as promised, my mercy is yours." In all elements of the bargain, the dragon proved to be as good as her word. Never again did she trouble the lands. Upon his return, the knight shocked his court by doing what none of the nobles ever expected him to. He claimed a bride. He told them of his adventures of the past year, and of the dragon that had taken his place. The very dragon that, now wearing a human body and clad in white, offered him her hand in marriage. And this hand the knight eagerly claimed. He retired from his crusades, choosing instead to concentrate efforts on building the wealth of his kingdom as a whole, and not simply his own personal treasury. Under the guidance of his wise wife, he built his lands into the richest in the kingdom. The king himself, impressed by the progress, requested audiences with the knight's bride. This is not to say the knight never fought another war, for there would always be new enemies threatening the land from without, as well as from within. But never again did the knight seek either fame or glory. Ironically, the dragon granted the knight the very immortality he had once craved as well, for his children passed down the tale of the dragon's riddle to their children, and from their children to theirs. The tale spread like wildfire, and as the knight was lain to his final rest, he passed into legend. His wife, meanwhile, simply vanished, riding away to distant lands, having paid her final respects at her beloved husband's grave. Once beyond the kingdom's borders, she again became a dragon, and set off once more to seek another man as loving, wise, and compassionate as her one great love had been. She's still out there today, in fact, still searching. She has found many good men in her long years, I am glad to say, and there's little doubt she will find another. And she's not alone. Many other dragons have seen the light, and they too have embarked upon the age-old search for a worthy mate, someone strong of character, wise, loving, and merciful. So always, always remember the dragon's 3 great treasures, for the day may come when you, too, must answer the dragon's riddle, and should you succeed, well, wisdom, mercy, and love may well be yours.